Good evening or good morning, as the case may be, to all the friends. I'm very pleased and honored today to be the host. I see that Mr. Khalid is already online, but since I've started, I'll go on. Today is the 10th in the series of reading and discussions from the book by Dr. Martin Lings, the Book of Certainty. And we have with us, as usual, Dr. Reza Shah-Kazemi to take us on. Today we are going to read from chapter 4, the law of certainty. I now pass on to Dr. Reza to continue.
All right, thank you very much, Abdurrahman. Yes, we've come to chapter 4, and thankfully it's a short chapter. I say thankfully because we've spent a very long time, and I'm guilty of this more than anybody else, perhaps expanding too much, going off into too many different directions from this very, very rich text. And now I think it's time to be more focused on the text itself. And it's a short chapter, so we should be able to not just have the chapter read by Abdurrahman Adnan, but also we can have some minimal comments from myself and then go into a question and answer session. So if I could ask you, Abdurrahman, to read. It's not even 2 pages actually. It's 1.5 pages. So if you could kindly set the ball rolling and start the reading for us.
Chapter 4, the law of certainty. Starts with a quotation from the Quran, chapter 2, verses 37 to 38. Then Adam received words from his Lord, who relented towards him. Verily, he is the relenting, the merciful. We said, go fallen hence, all of you together. Yet assuredly will I send unto you a guidance, and whosoever shall follow my guidance, no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. In considering what the religions teach, it is essential to remember that the outside world is as a reflection of the soul of man, corresponding to it in all its details. This correspondence is sometimes expressed by saying that the world is like a big man, or that man is a little world, a microcosm. It is by reason of the correspondence between these two worlds that sacred utterances which refer directly to the outside world, the macrocosm, may be interpreted as referring also to the microcosm. In fact, religious teaching continually draws images from the macrocosm. For unlike the true man who sees and understands both worlds, the fallen man can only see the outer world in any distinctness of detail, his own soul being for him as a dark forest. Thus, for example, what the Quran says of the infidels, al-kafirun, may be understood not only as referring to the worst human beings in the outer world, but also as throwing light on the worst elements in the soul of the fallen man, which have their counterparts in the outer infidels. To take another example of correspondence, which bears more directly on what has gone before, one may say that the fountain of immortality, which springs from the center of the Garden of Eden, is the counterpart of the eye of certainty in the center of true man's soul. Or rather, that this eye is itself the real fountain of immortality, of which the fountain in Eden is as an outward reflection. And so, when it is said that Adam was driven out of the Garden of Eden, the meaning is that man in general had lost the inward paradise of the eye, as well as the paradise of the outer world. The state of the outer world does not merely correspond to the general state of men's souls. It also, in a sense, depends on that state, since man himself is the pontiff of the outer world. Thus, the corruption of man must necessarily affect the whole, and the conditions of the age which followed the primordial age were an outward sign that mankind in general no longer possessed the inward paradise. But although today men are so far from the paradise as to be almost beyond the reach of any reminder of it, the men of old were still near enough to be keenly aware of its loss. And indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that most of what the ancients have left behind them is stamped more or less clearly with the consideration of how a man might return to the paradise and become once more the true man. It was for the sake of this return that the law of certainty was given to man by means of the religions, and this is the guidance which is mentioned in the above quotation. Those who seek to follow the path of the return, al-tariqah, are mentioned in the chapter of the events as the foremost, or as-sabiqun. The Quran, chapter 56, verse 10, al-waqi'ah. Of such it is said that there are many among the earlier generations and few among the later generations. Afterwards, there is mention of those of the right, of whom it is said that there are many among the earlier generations and many among the later generations. And this may be taken as a reference to those whose virtue is to remain on the right side of the religious law, in contrast to those of the left who are in revolt against this law. It is owing to the natural tendency of all earthly things towards degeneration that the proportion of those who follow the path is much smaller in later than in earlier times.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, that's a nice short chapter, very clear. And I think rather than start to give any comments from myself, I'll begin by asking if there are any questions from the participants.
Okay, my question is that the law of certainty here, does it mean divine revelation, which is given to mankind for his guidance or divine inspiration? Does it also include intellectual intuitions and things like that, pure intellection?
Yes, well, it's the first stage. Who is speaking, by the way? I don't recognize your voice.
Yes, actually, I'm participating in this seminar for the first time. My name is Sayyid Abbas Zulkarnain Naqvi. I'm from Pakistan.
All right, well, welcome.
Thank you.
Ahlan wa sahlan. So at the beginning of the book that we're looking at, we are introduced to these 3 degrees of certainty. And this word law is a little bit, it's an old-fashioned word, which simply means the doctrine. But Dr. Lings was well aware of the nuances, and he chose this word for reasons best known to himself, instead of just saying the doctrine of certainty, the law, the tidings of certainty. And it refers to ilm al-yaqeen, as opposed to the ayn al-yaqeen, as opposed to the truth of certainty, haqq al-yaqeen. So at the very beginning of the book, Dr. Lings went through these 3 degrees, saying that the ilm al-yaqeen, the doctrine or the law, the knowledge of certainty, is that doctrine which is itself pertaining to that which is absolutely certain, but also it imparts certainty. So it's when you ask the question about whether this is revelation or intuition or so on and so forth, every aspect of the knowledge of the absolute that can take the form of doctrinal content, which in traditional Arabic discourse, it's referred to those sam'i aspects, which are those things that you hear. Anything you hear from outside, whether it's hadiths or verses of scripture or doctrine from Sufi masters, whatever it may be, if you hear it and it's coming to you from the outside and you're having news about it, then it falls into the category of the ilm al-yaqeen, the knowledge of certainty. Remembering that in this framework, it's the lowest level of knowledge. It's just knowledge that you hear about. It's data coming to you, but it is coming from either revelation or inspiration or intellectual intuition or whatever may be the source. You are receiving it as data. And then you are required to ascend through these 3 degrees from hearing about the truth, that which is absolutely certain, to attaining the eye of certainty, which is the normal. Dr. Lings, in one of the chapters, let me see, I think we had it recently, had this beautiful way of, yes, in fact, just the previous chapter, page 19, where the vice regent, the Khalifa and the saint, Wali, are describing the human nature as it was intended by God. So this person who has attained to the eye of the spirit, the eye of the heart, the eye of certainty, he says here on page 18 that the one who has attained the eye of certainty is he alone whose heart is lit with this moon. The moon standing for the heart, as opposed to the sun from which the haqq al-yaqeen emanates. So the moon, the heart, is the sort of normal possession, if you like, of Edenic or primordial man. And that one who has this eye of certainty doesn't just have to hear about the reality of God, but he can actually see the fire. Now, this is going back to the beginning of the book, where Dr. Ling said that the law of certainty, L-O-R-E, the doctrine of certainty, is like Moses when he hears about the fire. Then the eye of the certainty is when he sees it, and then the truth of certainty, the haqq al-yaqeen, is when he's completely extinguished in the fire. And that is the ultimate realization of the supreme self, what René Guénon would call the supreme identity. And here we're talking about tawheed, that which makes absolutely one, the realization of oneness, but not the transcendent exclusive unicity of the principle, but the immanent inclusive reality of the self. So it's what is expressed in Hinduism, tat tvam asi, that, referring to the transcendent, tvam, you are, asi. That transcendent reality is what your true self is. So just to repeat, this ilm al-yaqeen is knowledge that comes to you about God, whether it be from revelation or inspiration or intellectual inspiration or intuition, whatever. And then the ayn al-yaqeen is when the eye of the heart, the third eye, when it begins to open and you can actually have a vision of the sun, the supernal sun, of which your heart is a reflection. Your own heart reflects the spirit. And then the final degree, which we'll come to later on in the book, is the haqq al-yaqeen, where the individuality as such is completely extinguished, burnt up in the fire of knowledge. Again, to use rather Hindu sounding terms, we think of the idea of nirvana, meaning that which is like something snuffed out, extinguished. And fana, in Sufism, you're completely effaced. You have nothing left of your individual empirical self, and It's God alone who subsists in baqa ba'd al-fana. So even if the individuality continues to act and to think and to speak, it's now the divine reality that is thinking, speaking, acting through that individual in accordance with probably the most important hadith in terms of the definition of the state of the waliullah, of the saint, the friend of God, who in a hadith Qudsi, the divine says that man aada li waliyan fa'adhantuhu bil harb. He who opposes one of my friends, I declare war upon him. And then God describes the two degrees of realization, one corresponding to the performance of the outward rites, the obligatory rites, the fara'id, and then the higher degree in relation to the nawafil, the optional rites, the ones of free devotion from yourself that you give to God. And the Sufis understand this to refer to the dhikr, which is bighayri hisab. You do it all the time, as opposed to the salat, which you do sometimes and not at other times. So this nawafil degree is the higher one. It refers to the dhikr and other total gifts of self to the absolute. And at the end of that description, it says that when I love him, I love this slave who has given himself to become closer to me through nawafil. I become the hearing by which he hears, the sight by which he sees, the hand by which he strikes, and the foot whereupon he walks. So this identification is complete, but the distinction between the empirical individual and the supreme self is, of course, intact on the level of outward existential differentiation, but on the level of inward essential identification, we're talking about the one and only reality, which is that of walaya, as is expressed most beautifully in the Quran, verse 55 of chapter number 5. Innama waliyukumullah. Truly, you only have one wali, that is God. Your wali, that is the divine name, al-wali. Innama waliyukumullah wa rasuluhu walladina amanu alladina yuqimuna as-salah wa yu'tuna az-zakah wa hum raki'un. And this means that the walaya as such is one in its essence, rooted in the divine, but coming down, filtering through first the level of the prophetic reality, and then at the level of the believers. And in this category, the alladina amanu yuqimuna as-salah, those who perform the prayer, who give their alms while in a state of ruku, in the bowing position in the prayer. And this refers to Imam Ali, who was in that position when he pointed to his ring to give to a beggar who wanted alms. So Imam Ali represents that category of the true believer, who is the embodiment of walaya.
I actually have one more question. So after your response, so this means that until and unless supreme identity is achieved, there will be some trace of some kind of a distinction or trace of individuality or relativity, whatever you want to say, or the distinction between the seer and the seen, or the knower and the known. This is true. This distinction is completely removed only when the supreme identity is achieved. This is not removed even when you have eye of certainty. Still, there is some distinction that is involved.
Well, there is always a distinction, even after the supreme identity has been attained, because Dr. Lings has said that, and Ibn Arabi and others, of course, have said before him, that, for example, Ibn Arabi says, Al-Abd yabaqa al-Abd. The slave always remains the slave. For as long as you are speaking about existence and the individual subsisting, not having died, not having died, it's the the fana in question, where there is absolutely no distinction between the seer and the seen, no question of relativity of the individuality imposing upon the exclusive unicity of the absolute principle, that is only attained in the state, the hal of fana, when a halaj can exclaim, Anal haq. And he's not referring to his individuality. He's in a state, or he's poetically referring to the state, and as it were, speaking as if it's a hadith Qudsi, where God is speaking through him. That is exclusively the property of a momentary state for the individual, in the sense that the individual is burnt up in that fire of knowledge. And when, for example, Shankara gives his doctrinal treatises, he says, I am the immutable, I am this, I am that. He's speaking about what derives from that point of consciousness, which is the reflection of the divine reality within his own heart, but the empirical aspect of his consciousness has been completely absorbed, extinguished into the absolute. So it's what he calls, Shankara makes this distinction between the Vyavaharika and the Paramartika. Vyavaharika is the point of view from relativity, where distinctions are maintained, and Paramartika is where there are no distinctions. And part of the mystery of the religions is that you don't know when it's the Paramartik, when it's the supreme sub specie eternitatis, it's called in Latin, from the point of view of eternity. When is that viewpoint being affirmed, and when is it the point of view of relativity from the world, the human being? So even after these great saints, the great prophets, have attained the truth of certainty, the haqq al-yaqeen, they've been burnt in that fire of the supreme reality, even after this state of consciousness, this degree of realization has been attained, when they, as it were, return to their selves, back to normal differentiated consciousness, then they remain always subservient to the absolute in its personal manifestation. They remain subservient, obedient to those above them in the spiritual hierarchy. This is again what Shankara says at the end of his commentary on Gaudapada's Karikas. He says that I salute this knowledge that transcends me. I salute my guru. And if you ask me, how can I salute something apart from myself when I am the only self? I say to you that this is because I look at him from the relative viewpoint, and I owe him all the devotion I can possibly give him. So there is always going to be not so much a trace of egotism, but a trace of the ego, of the individuality that subsists. And this mysterious confluence between the subsistence of the individual as an individual, but the baqa, the subsistence of God through the individual, this mysterious paradox, which is so difficult to encompass by words and by formal thought and by reason and by logic, is given us in the form of an intuition of the incredible, what Ibn Arabi would call the station of hayra, of bewilderment. That how can it be that it's both al-haq and it's other than al-haq? It's both the reality and other than the reality. And this intuition of how two contradictories can come together is expressed beautifully in the Quran in the verse which addresses the Prophet, وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ إِذْ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى مَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. You did not throw the pebbles when you threw the pebbles, but God it was who threw. So you see, this is an intimation of this exalted state of supreme identity, that the Prophet is still there as a human being. He speaks, he throws, he does this and he does that. But the metaphysical reality is prevailing over, dominating over, penetrating through the physical reality of the Prophet doing this or doing that. So it's a way of affirming, first denying the physical plane altogether. You did not throw. This is an appearance. You didn't do it. God did it. But then it says you did not throw when you threw. So it's both a negation and an affirmation of the physical act prior to the higher affirmation of the metaphysical reality subsisting through that physical act and being the reality, the substance of that outward act. So anyway, we could talk about this for a bit longer. Now, I've been told by Abdul Ghazar that we need to go back to what Imam Ali said. تزعم أنك جرم صغير ولكن فيك انطواء العالم الأكبر فأنت الكتاب المبين الذي بأحرفه يظهر المضمر. I think I wanted to go on to say what Dr. Lings used to remind us of frequently, which is that the hadith Qudsi, that my earth hath not room to contain me, my heaven hath not room to contain me, but the heart of my believing servant hath room to contain me. So this is also what, of course, Jesus said, the kingdom of God is within you, it's in your heart. But this idea of the whole of the cosmos being present within oneself and being reflected within the soul, as Dr. Ling says, the outside world is as a reflection of the soul of man, corresponding to it in all its details, such that the world is like a big man, or that man is a little world, a microcosm. And this is extremely important when we go on to the next page. And Dr. Ling says the state of the outer world does not merely correspond to the general state of men's souls. It also, in a sense, depends on that state, since man himself is the pontiff of the outer world. And if you remember, we had that discussion about corruptio optimi pessima, that the corruption of the best becomes the worst. And so man, being the best creation, when he falls from paradise, in the way that we've described, that Dr. Lings has described in the book, describing possibly eons through which this fall takes place in historical terms, from thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. This gradual fall from paradise, which is mythologically and dramatically enacted in the narratives in Genesis and in the Quran, is describing a process that takes a huge amount of time in the course of which degeneration takes place. And that because man is the pontifex, he's the pontiff of the outer world, meaning the bridge builder, because he builds the bridge between heaven and earth, when he falls, his fall is not only going to be reflected in the outer world, but his fall will determine the accelerating degeneration of the outer world. So, and this is obviously something that Dr. Lings would have affirmed in relation to the contemporary ecological crisis, that what we see happening all around the world, these environmental disasters, are nothing other than reflections of a state of soul which we collectively, the Adamic community, we human beings, collectively have fallen prey to. And because we have fallen prey to this gross materialism and viciousness, this greed, this avarice, pride, arrogance. And in fact, on this subject, I would recommend that you read what Dr. Ling says about the 7 deadly sins in the chapter of that name. It's called The 7 Deadly Sins according to the symbolism of number. And it's in his book, Symbol and Archetype. And it's an extraordinary explanation of these 7 deadly sins as being caricatures or parodies of 7 virtues. And they correspond to the 7 planets. And that in itself shows that the way in which the macrocosm participates in the microcosmic degeneration of those virtues which are represented by the planets in their fullness, in their plenitude, and which, when become caricatured or inversions of themselves, they carry the whole of the cosmos down with them into this whirlpool of environmental catastrophe, which are nothing other than outward signs of the inward degeneration of our souls. So, thus the corruption of man must necessarily affect the whole, and the conditions of the age which followed the primordial age were an outward sign that mankind in general no longer possessed the inward paradise. And I'll just read the rest of this paragraph before opening up to any questions that you may have. But although today men are so far from the paradise as to be almost beyond the reach of any reminder of it, the men of old were still near enough to be keenly aware of its loss. And indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that most of what the ancients have left behind them is stamped more or less clearly with the consideration of how a man might return to the paradise and become once more the true man. It was for the sake of this return that the law of certainty was given to man by means of the religions. And this is the guidance which is mentioned in the above quotation. So let's go back to the quotation with which this chapter began. So it's Adam received words from his Lord, who relented towards him. Verily, he is the relenting, the merciful. We said, go fallen hence, all of you together. Yet assuredly will I send unto you a guidance. And whosoever shall follow my guidance, no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. So going back to your question, Abbas, about whether the law of certainty is only the religions, in this chapter, Dr. Lings is more or less implicitly saying that the doctrine of certainty, which imparts certainty to you, is these words of revelation from Adam. But in other places, one can say what we said earlier, that as insofar as the doctrine of God comes to you, whether it be from revelation or inspiration or intellectual inspiration of intuition of other people, insofar as it comes to you through those filters and you receive it, it's the doctrine, it's the level of the doctrine only, and you have to then do the work to follow the guidance, to do exactly what it says here. I will send unto you a guidance, and whoever shall follow my guidance, no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. And just one little point before I go open up to questions. It's interesting that Adam received words from his Lord, and then when God says to Adam to fall from paradise, it becomes the plural. It's no longer speaking to Adam or Adam and Eve. It's not in the singular, nor is it in the dual. It's in the plural. So here is exactly a kind of linguistic ishara to what Dr. Lings is saying, that the story of Adam's fall from paradise is the story of a gradual degeneration of the whole human race. And remember, we had that hadith that between the Adam that we know and the Adam that fell, there are 100,000 Adams. So this is a story of unimaginable complexity, but which our imaginations are given some kind of narrative in order to, an inspired narrative, a revealed narrative that will awaken in us an understanding of what it means to say that Adam fell from paradise. And Fritjof Schuon has said the reason why this story in Genesis and then in the Quran was never doubted by, was never questioned by countless generations of believers is because the story resonated with the very principle of the fall and of the redemption and of the revelation that is taking place every single day. It's reenacted in every single day in the deepest point of consciousness in your heart. And so it reminds you of what part of you, because if you remember, the whole Alam al-Akbar is contained within you, then something of you was there when this dramatic fall took place, and something of you is aware of it happening over eons of time. and something you is aware that you need to reach out and accept the guidance that's coming to you and to follow that guidance in order to be redeemed. So it awakens a kind of primordial memory, not a kind of empirical memory, but an intuition in the depths of one's heart that one was there, one has done that oneself, one has reached out for that fruit. All of it is something that is both imaginal and cosmological and metaphysical, and therefore mystically tasted by each and every soul when you hear this revealed retelling of the story of what happened to the creation of Adam over time. So I'll stop there for now and just open up to any questions that there may be.